Imagine a world that has suddenly fallen silent. You wake up in the morning, walk to the window, but the familiar noise of the city is gone. No shouting merchants, no creaking carts, not even church bells ringing. Do you know why? Because there is no one left to ring them, and there is no one left to listen to them anyway. You step outside, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. A sweet, sickening stench of rot that is soaked into everything. Your clothes, the walls of the houses, the earth itself. The doors of neighboring houses are flung wide open, or conversely, boarded up with planks in a cross shape. People are lying on the doorsteps. Some are still groaning, begging for water, while others have already started to turn black. And the scariest part is, this isn't a war. There are no enemy soldiers here, no fire and swords. The killer is invisible. It lingers in the air. It hides in the folds of your clothes. It waits. This isn't a script for a new zombie apocalypse movie, and it isn't a fantasy writer's imagination. This is the reality humanity faced in the mid-14th century. We call this time the Middle Ages, but those who survived it called it the Great Pestilence or the Black Death. Let's just think about the numbers, although the human brain struggles to grasp dry statistics. Historians say that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. But what does that actually mean? Imagine you walk into a crowded subway car or a bus. Now, mentally remove every second person. Just erase them. That is the scale of the catastrophe. In some regions of France and Italy, entire villages went extinct. Travelers could ride for days and find ghost towns where only domestic animals remained, wandering among the corpses of their owners. A chronicler of that time from Siena, an Italian named Agnolo di Terra, left a record that still gives us goosebumps. He wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife abandoned husband, one brother abandoned another. For this plague seemed to strike through breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. And I, Agnolo di Terra, buried my 5 children with my own hands." Think about that. A man burying 5 of his children with his own hands because there is no one else left. But the most terrifying thing in this story isn't even the death toll. The most terrifying thing is the absolute lack of understanding. People of that time didn't know what bacteria, viruses, or hygiene were. They didn't have microscopes. When their loved ones burned up in 3 days right before their eyes, covered in horrible black buboes, they had only one explanation. This is the end of the world. This is God's punishment. In this video, we won't bore you with complicated dates and names of kings that mean nothing to you. We will follow the trail of the most prolific serial killer in history. We will see how one tiny bacterium living in a flea's stomach managed to bring the greatest civilizations to their knees. We will learn how biological weapons were used hundreds of years before their official invention, why doctors wore those creepy beaked masks, and, most importantly, how this tragedy, ironically, made our lives better. The story of the Black Death is a story of human stupidity, fear, but at the same time, an incredible thirst for life. And it didn't start in the dirty alleys of Paris or London, as many think. Death came from where no one expected it, from the endless expanses of the East, carried by the wind of change and the greed of merchants. To understand how Europe turned into a graveyard, we need to rewind time a bit and travel thousands of kilometers east. Forget about dirty London or romantic Venice for a minute. Imagine the endless, sun-scorched steppes of Central Asia. Mongolia, China, the Gobi Desert. Places where the wind howls through the grass, and where you can travel for hundreds of kilometers without meeting a single living soul. It was here, in burrows underground, that an ancient evil slept. And I'm not just saying that for dramatic effect. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had lived in this area for thousands of years. It didn't touch humans because humans rarely crossed its path. Its natural reservoir was local rodents, mainly marmots. You've probably seen marmots. Funny, chubby animals that stand up like little pillars and whistle amusingly. In Asia, they were often hunted for their fur and meat. Local nomads had known a golden rule for centuries. If you see a marmot that doesn't run away, but wanders sluggishly or lies by its hole, do not touch it. It is cursed. This was folk wisdom written in blood. You do not touch a sick animal. But at some point, somewhere in the 1330s, something went wrong. What exactly happened? Most likely, nature itself was to blame. In the early 14th century, the planet's climate began to go crazy. This was the beginning of the so-called Little Ice Age. Terrible droughts began in Asia, followed by floods. The ecosystem was destroyed. Marmots and rats ran out of food in their usual wild habitats. And what do animals do when they're dying of hunger? They go to humans. Rodents migrated closer to human settlements, to grain barns, to warmth. And with them came their passengers, fleas packed with the plague bacterium. But how did a disease from a remote Mongolian steppe reach the entire world? Here, the main achievement of civilization at that time comes into play: the Silk Road. We're used to thinking of the Silk Road as something romantic, caravans of camels carrying precious fabrics, spices, porcelain. It was the main economic artery of the world, connecting China and Europe. It was the medieval internet, transmitting not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and news. But in the 1340s, the Silk Road turned into a perfectly lubricated conveyor belt of death. The irony was that the Mongol Empire had made these roads incredibly safe for merchants. You could walk with a sack of gold from Beijing to Crimea, and no one would rob you. That's how strictly the Mongols maintained order. This safety played a cruel joke. Thanks to fast and calm journeys, infected caravans, rats, and people were able to cover vast distances, spreading the infection before they had time to die. China took the first hit. Chronicles of those years read like reports from the front lines of the apocalypse. In Hebei province, 90% of the population died. 90! Imagine a country where only 1 out of 10 people survives. This wasn't just a plague, it was a collapse. Then the plague spread to India, mowing down millions. The most amazing thing is that Europe knew about it. Rumors reached them. Merchants told horrific stories that something was wrong in the East. But these stories sounded too fantastic. They said that a rain of fire was falling from the sky on China, that there were showers of frogs and snakes, that the earth was cracking and releasing poisonous fog. Europeans listened to this and nodded. Well, that's somewhere over there, far away, among the barbarians. It doesn't concern us. We have a civilized world here. God protects us. It is a classic human mistake to think that a disaster happening abroad will stop at customs. They didn't understand that death was already packed into bales of expensive silk and furs. It was already riding in wagons, wheels creaking along dusty roads. It was already sitting in the fur of black rats, sneaking into the holds of ships. By 1345, the plague had reached the shores of the Caspian Sea and the lower reaches of the Volga. It stood literally on the doorstep of Europe, raising its hand to knock. One step remained, one fatal incident that would turn a local outbreak into a global pandemic. And this incident happened in Crimea, in a city we know today as Feodosia, but back then it was called Kaffa. It was there that an event would occur which historians often call the first use of biological weapons in history. And we're going to talk about that right now. Before we learn how the plague smashed through the gates into Europe, we need to understand how this perfect killing mechanism works. Why is this bacterium so effective? It's all about a small middleman, the flea. We're used to thinking that the plague is a disease of rats. But in reality, rats are victims just like us. The main villain is the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And what it does inside the flea's body resembles the plot of a horror movie. When a flea drinks the blood of an infected animal, the bacteria enter its stomach. There, they begin to multiply furiously. But they don't just live there. They secrete a special enzyme that clots the blood into a solid lump. This lump literally blocks the flea's esophagus. Imagine having a gag stuck in your throat. The flea starts to go mad with hunger. It tries to drink blood, biting again and again. A rat, a gopher, a human, anyone. But the blood cannot get into the stomach because of the plug. The blood hits this plug, washes over the bacteria, and is regurgitated back into the bite wound. This isn't just a bite. It's an injection. The flea, dying of thirst itself, spits millions of deadly bacteria directly into the victim's bloodstream. It is a biological pump that doesn't stop until the flea dies. And when the host rat dies, the hungry fleas panic and look for a new source of heat. And the only warm creature nearby is often a human. Now, understanding that every such flea is a small ampoule of death, let's transport ourselves to 1346, to Crimea. Here, on the shores of the Black Sea, stood the wealthy trading city of Kaffa, today Feodosia. It was a Genoese fortress, a piece of Italy on Crimean soil. The city was powerful, the walls were high, trade was booming. But outside the city walls stood a huge army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Yani Beg. The Mongols had been besieging Kaffa for a long time. The siege dragged on. Both sides were exhausted. And then, something terrible began to happen in the Mongol camp. Soldiers started dying, not from Genoese arrows and swords, but from the very disease that had come with them from the steppes. Khan Yani Beg was furious. His army was melting before his eyes. The camp was turning into a huge open-air infirmary. Any other commander in such a situation would have lifted the siege and left to save the remnants of his people. But Yani Beg decided to make possibly the most vengeful and cruel move in military history. He ordered the corpses of his dead soldiers to be collected, bodies that had already turned black, covered in festering buboes. They were not buried. They were loaded into trebuchets, giant siege catapults. Imagine the horror of the residents of Kaffa. They're standing on the walls, hoping the Mongols are leaving. And suddenly they see not stones soaring into the sky, but human bodies. The dead flew over the high walls and fell with a dull thud onto the city streets, onto the roofs of houses, onto the market squares. The Italian notary Gabriel de Mussi, who is believed to have been a witness to these events, or recorded them from the words of eyewitnesses, wrote, "Mountains of the dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from this horror. Residents panicked and tried to dump the bodies into the sea, but it was too late. It wasn't even about the corpses themselves. It was the fact that along with the corpses, thousands of those infected fleas and rats flew into the city. The biological bomb had exploded. An epidemic began in Kaffa. The defenders of the fortress realized the battle was lost, the enemy was already inside. And this enemy was scarier than any Mongol sword. Panic set in. Genoese merchants, sailors, and the wealthy rushed to the port. They loaded onto their galleys, stuffed the holds with goods, and sailed away towards their native Italy. They thought they had been saved. They looked at the receding coast of Crimea and thanked God that they had escaped this hell. But they didn't know the main thing. They were taking hell with them. In the holds, among bags of grain and spices, rats were already sitting. And on the sailors' clothes, in the folds of the fabric, invisible killers were lurking. The fleet of death set a course for Europe. October 1347. Sicily, the port of Messina. Imagine an ordinary morning in a bustling trading port. Seagulls crying, dockers shouting, the smell of salt water and rotting fish. People on the pier are peering at the horizon. They are waiting for the Genoese fleet, waiting for silk, spices, news from the east. When the sails of 12 galleys appear on the horizon, a sigh of relief sweeps through the port. They've arrived. Trade will go on. But as the ships got closer, joy turned to bewilderment and then to chilling horror. The galleys were moving strangely. They were swaying on the waves. The sails hung like rags. No crew was visible on deck. The ships didn't dock masterfully as usual, but simply drifted until they bumped against the pier. People on the shore, still not understanding anything, rushed to the ships to secure the ropes and greet the sailors. What they saw on deck changed their lives forever. Most of the sailors were dead. Corpses lay in heaps right by the helms, among barrels and ropes. The few who were still alive looked not like humans, but like monsters. Their skin was covered in black spots and huge tumors. Buboes the size of an apple or an egg protruded from their groins and armpits. They used blood and pus. The sailors were delirious, coughing up blood and begging for water. Chronicler Michel de Piazza, who was in Sicily at the time, wrote, "The disease lay in their bones, and anyone who spoke to them caught the illness, from which there was no escape." Note this detail, spoke to them. People still didn't understand the mechanism. They thought they were getting infected through a look, through breath, through conversation. They missed the main thing. While the dock workers stared in horror at the dying sailors, while the city authorities decided what to do, the real passengers of these galleys were running ashore along the mooring ropes. Black rats. Hundreds, thousands of rats. They fled from ships that smelled of death into a rich city full of food. Realizing what the ships had brought, the authorities of Messina ordered the galleys to be driven out of the port immediately. "Get out! Away!" they shouted. The ships were indeed driven back out to sea, where they became real Flying Dutchmen, drifting with dead crews. But it was too late. The ropes had been cast. The rats were in the city. The fleas had already found new victims. Chaos began in Messina. People started dying by the hundreds. Panic flared up instantly. Those who could walk fled the city. Residents grabbed children, belongings, and ran deep into the island, to Catania, to Palermo. They thought they were running away from death. In reality, they were working as couriers of death. Refugees would arrive in a neighboring city. They would be let in, pitted, and 3 days later, hell would begin in that city. Sicily went extinct with lightning speed. But this was just the beginning. From Sicily, the plague jumped to the mainland. In early 1348, it hit Pisa and Genoa. The Genoese, the very ones whose ships brought the infection, tried to lock the gates, but in vain. Then it was Venice's turn. Venice was perhaps the smartest city of that time. The authorities of Venice were the first to realize that something had to be done with arrivals. They introduced a rule. Any ship must stay at anchor away from the shore for 40 days before it is allowed to unload goods. This word, 40, sounds like quaranta in Italian. This is where the word quarantine was born. Venetians invented quarantine, tried to save themselves from the Black Death. Did it help? Partially, but they didn't account for one thing. Quarantine detained people, but it couldn't detain rats that swam excellently and fleas that lived in bales of cloth. Despite all efforts, Venice lost 60% of its population. The great city of canals turned into a city morgue, where gondolas were used not for romantic rides, but as floating hearses packed to the brim with bodies. Italy fell. The gates to Europe were flung wide open. The plague, having rested on the coast, moved north to France, Spain, and England. Its march was rapid. It covered 3 to 4 kilometers a day. Seems like a little, but in a year, it covered entire kingdoms. No army could stop it. No prayers helped. Now let's look this enemy in the face. What exactly did the disease look like? What did a person feel who woke up healthy and by evening realized they were doomed? Warning. The next chapter is not for the faint of heart. We will break down the symptoms as the doctors of that time saw them. Imagine it is 1348. You live in Florence or Paris. The morning starts as usual. You feel a slight weakness, a little chill, a headache, probably just a cold, you think. The weather is lousy. You drink some hot wine, get under the blanket, and hope to sleep it off. But by lunchtime, you realize this is not a cold. The temperature spikes so sharply that you start shaking with fever. The thirst becomes unbearable. Your heart pounds like crazy, and then you feel pain. A strange, pulling pain in the groin, armpits, or neck. You feel the spot and find a hard, hot lump. This is the bubo. This is the mark of death. A bubo is an inflamed lymph node. Your body is trying to stop the bacteria by creating a barrier, but it is losing. In a matter of hours, this lump grows to the size of a chicken egg or even an apple. They hurt terribly. The pain is so intense that strong grown men scream out loud and bang themselves against walls. But the worst happens next. The buboes start to darken. They turn purple, then jet black. Pus and dead tissue accumulate inside them. If you're lucky, if you can call it luck at all, the bubo will burst on its own. Foul-smelling sludge will gush out of it. Doctors of the time thought this was a good sign, bad blood coming out. But most often, it didn't help. Why was the disease called the Black Death? It's not just about mourning. It's about sepsis. Bacteria entered the bloodstream and spread throughout the body. Tiny blood vessels in the fingers, toes, and nose began to burst and die. In a living person, limbs turned black as coal. Gangrene devoured the body alive. The person literally began to rot before their heart stopped. The smell in the patient's room was so bad that healthy people couldn't stay there without a handkerchief soaked in vinegar pressed to their nose. And now imagine that this wasn't the only form of the disease. Sometimes the bacterium didn't get into the lymph nodes, but straight into the lungs. This was called pneumonic plague, and this was a death sentence with no right of appeal. If you had a chance to survive the bubonic form, about 20 to 30%. The pneumonic form killed in 100% of cases. The person started coughing, first dry, then with phlegm, and then with pure scarlet blood. And this is where the real nightmare for those around began. Every drop of blood flying out of the patient's mouth when coughing contained millions of bacteria. Now, neither rats nor fleas were needed for infection. It was enough just to stand next to a coughing friend. The famous Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived this hell, left a phrase that became the motto of that era. A man could have lunch with his friends and dinner with his ancestors. Death was lightning fast. In the morning you are healthy, in the evening, a corpse. This pace destroyed not only the population, it destroyed humanity. The psychological shock was stronger than the physical one. People went mad with fear. The strongest social bonds snapped like rotten threads. Mothers abandoned their children as soon as they saw the first signs of the disease. Husbands locked wives in rooms and fled. Children left old parents to die alone. Every man for himself. This was the new law of Europe. Priests who were supposed to comfort the dying were afraid to enter houses. Doctors demanded huge money for a visit, but often just stood in the doorway, gave useless advice, and left. Cities turned into morgues. Corpses were first tried to be buried in a Christian way, in coffins with a funeral service. But the coffins ran out in a week. What became a deficit? Then they started digging huge trenches. Bodies were dumped there by the hundreds like garbage. One chronicler cynically but accurately described it. Bodies were laid in layers, covered with earth, just as one places layers of dough and meat when making lasagna. Think about that. People were buried like lasagna. And then, amidst this madness, strange figures appear on the streets of dead cities. They're dressed in long wax coats, wide-brimmed hats on their heads, and long canes in their hands. But the creepiest part is their faces, or rather masks. Long, white bird beaks with round glass eyes. Plague doctors. Today, it is a popular Halloween costume, a symbol of steampunk and mystery. But back then, their appearance on the doorstep meant only one thing. There is no more hope. Who were these people? Heroes trying to save humanity, or charlatans profiting from grief? And, damn it, why do they need that beak? If I ask you to draw an association with the word plague, you will most likely draw a man in a black cloak and a mask with a long bird beak. This image has become a symbol of the era. It scares us in horror movies. It looks at us from the pages of comic books. But let's figure it out. Why did they need this beak? Were they trying to scare death away? Or was it some strange religious ritual? In fact, the plague doctor's costume is perhaps the first hazmat suit, NBC suit, in human history. The prototype of a modern spacesuit. In the 14th century, no one knew about microbes. But doctors believed in the theory of miasmas. They believed that the disease was transmitted through bad smells, through poisoned air. The logic was simple. If it smells like rot, then there is disease. To avoid inhaling death, the air had to be filtered. This is where the beak came in. It wasn't just decoration. It was a gas mask. The hollow beak was tightly packed with strong-smelling herbs, dried flowers, camphor, cloves, incense, garlic, and even sponges soaked in vinegar. The doctor breathed through this filter. It was believed that the scent of herbs disinfected the plague air before it entered the lungs. The rest of the costume was also thought out to the smallest detail. The cloak wasn't just fabric, it was soaked in wax or fat. Why? So that liquids wouldn't stick to it. If blood, pus, or sputum from a patient got on the doctor, it would simply slide down without soaking into the clothes. Leather gloves on the hands, glass inserts for the eyes, and, of course, the cane. The famous plague doctor's cane wasn't for leaning on while walking. It was a tool for remote examination. With the cane, the doctor lifted the patient's clothes, felt the buboes with the cane, and used the cane to fend off overly persistent infected people who begged for help. The rule was strict. Do not touch the patient with your hands. But here's the main question. Did these doctors help? Honestly, practically no. Medicine in the 14th century was a mix of superstition, astrology, and sadism. If you fell into the hands of such a specialist, your chances of survival often decreased. Let's look at the treatment methods. They make your hair stand on end. The most popular method was bloodletting. Doctors sincerely believed that the disease was in the blood, and if you let out the bad blood, the person would feel better. They cut the veins of people who were already weak. Naturally, patients died faster simply from loss of strength. The second method was lancing the buboes. The doctor would take a knife, cauterize or not the bubo, and cut it open to let the pus out. Then the wound was cauterized with red-hot iron. The pain was hellish, anesthesia didn't exist, at most a glass of wine or a club to the head. Sometimes it helped if the body was strong, but more often dirt got into the open wound and a new infection began. But there were also completely insane recipes. For example, the frog method. They took a live frog or toad and applied its belly to the plague bubo. It was believed that the toad, like a sponge, draws out the poison. The frog was held until it died or until it swelled up. Then they took the next one, or urine baths. Wealthy patients were offered to drink powder made of emeralds, which simply flushed jewelry down the toilet, or molten gold. The poor were given mercury or arsenic in small doses to drink. That is, if the plague didn't kill you, the doctor finished you off with heavy metals. Who even went to work as such doctors? Real, respected professors of medicine often fled the cities first. For the positions of city plague doctors, they hired those who had nothing to lose. These were dropout students, former charlatans, unsuccessful medics. The city paid them a huge salary, but it was suicide money. The plague doctor's contract was essentially a last will and testament. In Venice, out of 18 hired doctors, only one remained alive by the end of the year. The rest died. Beaked suits didn't save them from fleas. The flea didn't care what it smelled like in your beak. It just jumped into the gap between the pant leg and the boot and did its job. These people were not so much healers as accountants of death. Their main task was to enter houses, pronounce death, and keep records of the dead. They were harbingers of the end. The knock of their cane on the door meant that this house was cursed. But people, crazed with grief, didn't look for blame in medicine. They needed to find someone who brought this trouble. If doctors can't help, then it's a conspiracy. It means someone poisoned the water. It means God turned away from us because of someone's sins. And then the hunt began. The most terrible hunt in medieval history, when people, fleeing the plague, began to kill each other with even greater cruelty than the disease itself. Fear is fuel. If there's too much of it, it inevitably ignites into aggression. Imagine the psychology of a medieval person. You see your loved ones dying. You pray to God, but God is silent. You pay the doctor, but the doctor is powerless. You have a question, what for? And more importantly, who is to blame? The human brain is wired so that it is easier for us to believe in malicious intent than in the randomness of nature. We need an enemy that can be seen, grabbed, and destroyed so that this nightmare ends. And Europe began to go mad. The first manifestation of this mass psychosis was the movement of the flagellants. Imagine a picture. A procession of hundreds of people enters a quiet, dying city. They walk in twos, gloomy, with hoods on their heads. They sing mournful hymns. And suddenly, at a signal, they strip off their shirts, exposing their backs, and begin to beat themselves with whips. At the ends of these whips are iron spikes. Blood splashes onto the pavement, onto the spectators. People faint, but the procession does not stop. They believe that the plague was God's punishment for the sins of humanity. And if they suffer voluntarily, if they show God their pain, then he will change anger to mercy. It was like a crazy rock tour. Flagellants walked from city to city, gathering crowds of fans. People greeted them like saints, dabbed handkerchiefs in their blood, believing it to be healing. But the irony of fate was cruel. These holy martyrs were actually super spreaders of the plague. They walked dirty, with open festering wounds on their backs, carrying the infection from one region to another faster than any rats. The church tolerated them at first, but then the Pope declared them heretics and banned them. Because even the church understood, this is no longer faith, this is fanaticism. But if the flagellants tortured themselves, another part of society was looking for someone to kill. Rumors began to crawl. Scary, sticky rumors. Have you noticed that Jews are dying less often than Christians? They know some secret. They want to destroy the Christian world. In reality, mortality in Jewish communities was also high, but sometimes slightly lower simply due to laws of hygiene. Religious rules required them to wash their hands more often and not eat certain foods. Plus, they lived in ghettos isolated. But the crowd didn't need facts. The crowd needed blood. The most terrible conspiracy theory of the Middle Ages was born: poison wells. Someone started a rumor that Jews were throwing bags of poison into city water sources at night. It didn't matter that Jews drank water from the same wells. Logic turned off. Pogroms began. These were not spontaneous fights. It was systematic destruction. The most monstrous case occurred in Strasbourg on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1349. Even before the plague arrived in the city itself, the residents decided to act proactively. They herded 2,000 Jews into the city cemetery. A huge wooden platform was built there. People were given a choice: convert or burn. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. Those who refused to betray their faith were burned alive. Within a year, hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed. In Mainz, in Cologne, in Brussels. But do you know what is the vilest thing in this story? It wasn't just about fear. It was about money. Many Jews were moneylenders. The church forbade Christians to lend money at interest. Many citizens, knights, and even bishops had huge debts to Jewish bankers. By killing the creditor, you destroy the debt. Chroniclers wrote directly, "Many went to kill not for the sake of God, but to take receipts and gold." It was legalized robbery under the guise of an epidemic. It wasn't just Jews who got hit. They killed all outsiders: cripples, beggars, foreigners, gypsies. In some cities, people with skin diseases, for example, psoriasis, were killed, thinking that they were the carriers. Europe turned into a jar of spiders. It seemed that civilization was over. There was no one to cultivate the fields, the harvest rotted. Cattle wandered unattended and died too. There was no authority. Laws didn't work. Culture stopped. But the night is darkest just before the dawn. When the smoke from the funeral pyres cleared and the plague, having had its fill, began to retreat, the survivors looked around. And with surprise, they discovered that the world had changed. And, as cynical as it sounds, for many, it had changed for the better. A new era was coming. An era born on bones. Sounds blasphemous, right? How can one talk about prose when half of Europe lies in graves? But history is a cynical lady. And if you were a simple peasant or craftsman lucky enough to survive, then the world after 1353 became paradise for you. To understand this, let's remember how life was arranged before the plague. Europe was overpopulated. There were too many people and little food and land. Peasants were nobody. They were expendable material. A lord could say, "Work for a piece of bread or leave. There's a line of 10 other beggars behind the fence." And it was true. Labor cost pennies. Life cost pennies. But when the plague fog cleared, the survivors looked around and realized the line is gone. Imagine you come to work, and half of your colleagues have disappeared. But the work remains. Fields need to be plowed, crops harvested, houses built, sheep sheared. Lords and landowners are in panic. Their grain is rotting in the fields. They run to the remaining peasants and order them to work. And the peasant leans on a shovel, looks at the Lord, and for the first time in history says, "No, I won't work for stew. I want a coin, silver, and meat for lunch." The Lord is furious. How dare this riff-raff set conditions? The kings of England and France even issued special laws forbidding wage increases above the 1347 level. They try to freeze prices. But you can't trick the economy with decrees. If the lord refused to pay, the peasants simply turned around and went to a neighboring lord who was ready to pay anything just not to die of hunger. The greatest redistribution of the labor market occurred. Salaries soared 2 to 3 times. Yesterday's poor man, who had never eaten anything but porridge, could suddenly afford meat, beer, and good clothes. Historians call this period the golden age of the proletariat. Moreover, it was the plague that essentially killed serfdom in Western Europe. The old system, where a person was tied to the land like a slave, collapsed. People became mobile. They went where it was better. Not only money changed, things changed. Imagine cities. Half the houses are empty. Clothes, furniture, tools, dishes remained in these houses. And all this now belonged to the survivors. Heirs received fortunes that had been accumulating for centuries. The poor dressed in velvet and silks that only aristocrats used to wear. The line between classes began to blur. But the most important change happened in people's heads. Before the plague, the church was the absolute authority. The priest said, "Obey, endure, and you will go to heaven." But the plague showed a terrible truth. Priests died just as fast as sinners. Bishops locked themselves in castles and died there. Prayers didn't stop buboes. People had a crisis of faith. No, they didn't become atheists. It was impossible at that time. But they started asking questions. If the church can't protect us, why do we blindly believe it? If life is so short and can end at any moment, why suffer? Why wait for paradise later if you could try to live now? This shift in consciousness triggered tectonic processes. Instead of relying only on prayers, people began to take an interest in medicine. Real medicine. Doctors began to secretly dissect corpses to understand how the body works. Previously, this was strictly forbidden. The flourishing of universities began. Old professors died, and their places were taken by young, daring minds with new ideas. It was on this soil, fertilized by the ashes of the plague, that what we call the Renaissance grew. Art changed. Before the plague, paintings were flat and strictly religious. After the plague, realism appeared in them. Drama appeared, the human appeared. Look at the paintings of that time. There are dances of death, danse macabre. Everywhere, skeletons dancing with kings. It was a reminder, memento mori, remember death. But it was also a call, live while you are alive. The plague also pushed technical progress. Not enough hands. So, we need to invent mechanisms that will replace people. Water mills, new machines, the improvement of the printing press a bit later. All these are echoes of the shortage of people. Humanity was forced to become smarter to survive. So, looking back, we can say a creepy thing. Modern European civilization, with its human rights, science, and comfort, was largely born because 700 years ago, a rat bit a man. But did this story end? Is the plague gone forever, leaving us only with bonuses and scary legends? Or is it just hiding? In the final chapter, we will travel to the present day and find out where the Black Death is hiding now. We have come a long way from marmots in the Mongolian steppes to the bonfires of the Inquisition in the center of Europe. And now, sitting in a comfortable chair in the 21st century, it is very easy to say, well, that was a long time ago. That is history, like dinosaurs or mammoths. The plague is no more. If you think so, I have bad news for you. The Black Death hasn't gone anywhere. It is not extinct. Right now, while you're watching this video, the bacterium Yersinia pestis lives and breeds. Where? Yes, perhaps closer than you think. Every year, the World Health Organization records between 1,000 and 3,000 cases of plague. Not in history textbooks, but in real hospitals. Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Peru. Outbreaks occur regularly in these countries. In 2017, a major outbreak of pneumonic plague, its most terrible form, occurred in Madagascar. More than 200 people died. The panic was the same as in the Middle Ages. People stormed pharmacies, fled cities, were afraid to go out into the street. But don't think this is just a problem for poor countries. The USA, one of the most developed countries in the world. Every year, they record an average of 7 cases of plague. Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California. Who is to blame? The same cute, fluffy creatures. Prairie dogs, squirrels, chipmunks in national parks. Tourists love feeding them, get close, and sometimes take away a deadly souvenir. In Mongolia and China, entire cities are periodically quarantined. Why? Because locals still eat marmots. It is considered a delicacy and good for health. In 2019, a couple of tourists in Mongolia ate raw marmot liver, a folk remedy. Result: death of both, city closed, hundreds of people in isolation. So why are we dying by the millions like in the 14th century? Why is news about the plague now just a note in a newspaper and not an alarm signal? The answer is simple: antibiotics. What killed entire kingdoms is cured today with a course of pills. Regular streptomycin or doxycycline kill Yersinia pestis on the spot. If, of course, you're on time. The main enemy today is not the disease itself, but time. If a doctor realizes you have the plague, they will save you in a couple of days. But the problem is that modern doctors in megacities rarely think about the plague. They diagnose flu, pneumonia, and precious time runs out. The plague taught humanity a cruel lesson. It showed us how fragile we are. Our cities, our laws, our economy, all this can collapse in a couple of months under the onslaught of an invisible enemy. But also showed our incredible strength. We didn't just survive. We became stronger. We invented quarantines. We understood the importance of hygiene. We created modern medicine. We learned to wash our hands. After all, looking at the events of the 14th century, it is difficult not to notice parallels with our time. When a pandemic comes, people behave the same way. Whether in 1347 or in 2020. First denial, it's just a cold. Then panic, then finding the guilty, conspiracy theories, and finally acceptance and adaptation. Psychology does not change. But there is one important difference. The people of the Middle Ages had only prayer and a beaked mask. We have science. We no longer divine by the stars. We decode genomes. We are the descendants of those who survived. In our veins flows the blood of the luckiest, strongest people who survived hell on earth. The Black Death tried to wipe us off the face of the planet, but instead, it pushed us towards the Renaissance. So, the next time you see a cute squirrel in the park, give it a nut, but from a distance. And for God's sake, wash your hands afterwards.